Hello guys and welcome to my tutorial. Mr.NET is here and today I'm going to talk about the observer pattern in C#. To explain the observer pattern I use the SystemI-Observable interface and the SystemI-Observer interface. For the observer implementation I need three things. The first is a data object. This object contains all information what the observes. Then I need a provider or a publisher. This provider contains all observers that are interested to the data object, and also I need the observers what are interested to the data object information. For example, the data object pushes the information or the change state to the provider, and the provider delegates it to his observers. The advantages of this is that the data object does not know his observers, and I can subscribe and unsubscribe dynamically at runtime the observers. So now we look into the source code. The first thing what I implement is the data object. For this I create a class called data object. And this class contains important information for me. For example, a private string data. This data object contains my information data. And now the next object is a provider or a publisher. This is also an own object, so I create a class called provider, and this provider implements the interface I-Observable, and the type T is the data object what we created, what contains the data. So data object, and I also need to implement the methods. To this method I come later in the video. The dirt object is my observer object. This is also an own class, observer, and the observer object implements the interface observer, and the type T here is also the data object which contains the data what the observer observes. Data object, and I have also implement the interface methods, and I explain these methods later in the video. So if we look into this picture, we see that the data object pushes the information to the provider. So my data object here needs a method what is called the provider, that says the provider the data is actualized. So for this I create here a public method called setData, and this data gets the message from this argument. And now the provider has to offer a method that allows that the data object can push the message to the provider. So I create here also a method called notify. No, string message. And with this method I can push the new information to the provider. Also I need an instance of a provider. There are many or several possibilities to implement that. I create, for my example, a private instance of a provider. And this provider instance is set through a constructor. And the constructor takes the argument of a provider instance, and I can set the provider what I get through the argument. And now I can here call the notify method from my private provider instance and delegate the message to the provider. The next thing what is to do, if we look at these pictures, we see that the provider pushes the data to the observers. When I look to the observer, we have a onNext method, and this method takes as an argument the data object and we see that we do not need only the data as a message, we need the data object instance. So I delegate this instance to the provider, and the provider takes the data object as an argument in his notify method. And now I can delegate this data to each subscribed observer. So firstly I need a list with subscribed observers. So I create a list with observers from type data object. I only need the interface. I call this list observers. And this list contains all observers, so I can iterate through each observer in my observer list and call in each observer the onNext method. So I can delegate the data to each observer. The next point is that our observers needs a possibility to subscribe and to unsubscribe into the provider. So for that I have this method here, what is provided through the interface subscribe. And this method takes an observer object, and this observer object I have to insert into my observer list. So if the observers does not contains the given observer, I add the given observer into the list. And now we see that the subscribe method returns a IDisposeAble object, or an object that implements the interface IDisposeAble. And the IDisposeAble allows to unsubscribe from the observer. For that, I create a own class called unsubscriber, and this class implements the IDisposeAble interface. So now we can provide a method dispose through the interface IDisposeAble, and if an observer calls the dispose method, we have to unsubscribe him from this list. So for that, I implement a constructor, and in the constructor I give a reference to this list and also the current observer. In my unsubscriber class, I create also a private list of observers, and a private instance of an IObserver object. So the observer inside this class is the reference to this list, and this observer what I get through the argument, this observer is the current observer what is subscribed. And now if an observer calls the dispose method, I can implement here observers remove the observer. So now this observer is removed from this list, which is a reference to this list. So the observer is unsubscribed from the list, and the unsubscriber I have to return after the subscribing. New unsubscriber with the reference to my observers and the current observer object. So perfect. Now we have the method which allows us to subscribe an observer, and we have also an object that allows us to unsubscribe an observer. The last thing what I have to do is to modify the observer. We have here the method onNext. For example, if this method is called, the notified method gives the instance to the provider, and the provider called for each observer what is subscribed the onNext method. So I implement here just a method to print out the information that I can show that the observer gets the message. Observer with a name message. Oh, yes, of course. This data is private. I set it public. And the setter method is private. This private is because if you set the data directly without this method, the change will be not notified. So now I can get my data, and I also implement a private string called name, not private string name, and this name, I have to use it in the class, sorry. This name is only to identify the observer instance. So I create an observer constructor and take as an argument the name of the current instance. This name is the given argument. So well, then this method on error you can use to tell the observer that something went wrong in the provider. You can give the observer the exception instance and handle this exception in the observer. But in this tutorial I doesn't implement this onError method. The onComplete method is used if onNext method needs more time. Maybe the data object is a socket connection. So you can transport here data, and if the transport is finished, or if the connection is to refused, then you can call the onComplete method, and then you can delete the socket connection. But in this tutorial I also does not implement this method. Well, we also need an object that contains the unsubscriber, because if this observer is registered or subscribed into a provider, with this instance we can unsubscribe from the provider. Oh yes, this object is an IDisposeAble. This is because our subscribe method in the provider returns a IDisposeAble. So that's with the observer, and now I want to show it with some examples. First I need a provider instance, new provider. Then I need a data object, and the data object needs a provider instance. Then I need observers, observer1, and the observer name is observer1, and I implement also a second observer, just for example. So now if I start the program, I can set a new data into the data object. I call it message1. Now, if I start the program, we see only start and finish is the result. Only start and finish. This is because these two observers are not subscribed to the provider. So I have to say provider subscribe and give the subscribe method an observer instance. And the subscribe method returns the iDisposeAble object, and we save the iDisposeAble object in our unsubscriber, so I can use the unsubscriber to unsubscribe from the provider. I subscribe also the second observer. Now if I start the program, we see that observer 1 gets the message 1 and observer 2 gets also the message 1. I can also write line unsubscribe a observer. I say observer 1 unsubscriber and call the iDisposeAble method dispose. This method is used to unsubscribe from the provider. Now if I start the program, I have to actualize the message to message2. Now if I start the program, we see observer 1 gets message 1, observer 2 gets also the message 1. Then I unsubscribe the first observer and only the second observer gets the message 2. So that's it. I hope you like this tutorial about the observer pattern with C#. If I forgot something, please write this into the comments so I can improve my videos for you. And yes, we see you hopefully next time. Bye.